right, very good afternoon to you all, ladies and gentlemen. Without further ado, my name is Xolisa Philip. I am a South Africa correspondent for the Africa Report. Today, we're going to be talking about accelerating rural connectivity and closing the digital divide. Now, despite vast opportunities to expand rural connectivity and close the urban-rural divide, which is estimated at 50 and 15%, internet penetration is quite low in rural Africa. Profitability for digital services in the rural context remains low and is unmatched by the urban centers because of low population densities. As we look at this topic and the fact that 94% of Africa's population lives in rural areas and they do not have access to internet connectivity, Boye Ademola, who is the partner at KPMG, is going to set us off and start us off on this conversation. Boye leads KPMG's digital transformation initiatives on the continent. Please take us away.
All right, thank you for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I trust you had a great conference. Like myself, the networking, I think, at the Africa CEO Forum is excellent, and the content's really interesting. So we're talking rural connectivity this afternoon, and a few big numbers: 1.2 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa. And if you think about that for a moment, and the size of that, and the opportunity that having them connected can bring to the continent, we're really talking about something that could be a catalyst, all right, for Africa's growth socially and economically. I have a few slides to set the panel discussion going, and if I can have my slides, I'm basically going to talk about coverage, right? How much of Africa is covered from a connectivity perspective? And then we'll look at usage. And I think the numbers will be interesting, for us to see in terms of what is the reason why we have this challenge, all right? So this is the slide. This is the slide. And if you look at this slide, numbers are interesting, they say. If you look at where we are in 2021, from a coverage perspective, really, we are talking about a coverage gap of 17%. That number, when I first saw it, under 20%, suggests that there is really no infrastructure issue, all right? There's no connectivity infrastructure issue in Africa. Or it's not as big as we imagine. But we have to be careful with numbers. In my next slide, then we will look at what sort of connectivity is this? Is this 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G? So is this, what you will call quality internet connectivity? So that's the first thing, right? Then in the next, if you go down just one line, we'll be looking at the usage gap. And that's where it gets really interesting for me, where we are looking at a gap of 61% from a usage gap perspective. All right, so even though coverage gap reduced, right, over the 7-year period, the usage gap deteriorated. And we're talking about 680 million people, all right, that have internet connectivity but are not using the internet. Think about that for a minute. Almost 700 million Africans now have connectivity but are not using the internet. Why? That's a startling figure. And then we have the connected, all right? So the connected obviously have connectivity and are using the internet. So we're talking to 40 million people in Africa. They have connectivity in sub-Saharan Africa, and they are using the internet, all right? So these figures, give us a reason to reflect over the coverage gap, what we need to do from an infrastructure perspective, and ensuring that the population, there's proper coverage, quality coverage that really we can do stuff. And then from a usage gap perspective, I think this is something that, requires, a lot of some measure of investigation. Let me use the term investigation. Are these customer issues? Are these experience issues? Are these security issues? Is it regulation? Is it digital literacy? So I think as we get into the panel, we'll discuss some of this. And then, of course, we have the connected. What is important is that we have a huge population, 1.2 billion, like I said, young population, digital natives, all right? So where do we have this gap? And that's why, this focus is on rural connectivity of our session this afternoon. Okay, so this just shows you the point I was making earlier, the quality of the connectivity. So you see the global coverage from a 5G, 4G, 3G perspective, and you see Africa's coverage from a quality perspective, 3G, 4G, 5G. You can see 5G is just not yet picked up in sub-Saharan Africa. 4G picking up, 3G, and again, that's back, to the quality conversation. In this next slide, then, I basically am examining some of the key issues around this usage gap, the root causes. But again, this is up for debate. Is it cost of devices? Are we talking about digital literacy? How important is literacy in all of this? Is it a question of just not knowing what is there, not understanding the fact that the internet is available and can be a world of good? It can open my life to new horizons for rural dwellers, all right? Or is it cyber? And we've had a number of these cyber issues. The cyber issues we're seeing are growing by the day, both from state actors, non-state actors, and so on and so forth. So that's also something that, could potentially be affecting this. I really don't, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I think we all know that, we need a connected Africa. Connectivity drives economic inclusion. It drives social development. In fact, if you look at Africa, a few people, edutechs, will argue with you that the current models of building schools, of building universities cannot scale from an Africa perspective because of the cost. And we really need to leverage digital to access communities that are rural and deliver education with new models. If you go to agriculture, it's the same conversations that are going on with agri-tech, all right, looking at platforms that enable us, to meet the farmers at the point of their needs, because a lot of the rural population are farmers, understanding how to enable farming, how to understand farming cycles, harvested products, how to do better logistics, for harvested products, of taking and so on and so forth. The whole life cycle. If you go to healthcare, it's the same conversation. So health tech, providers are also saying the primary healthcare systems cannot scale. We just don't have the capital to build all these health centers for 600 million people. And so we need to look at it. And if we're going to look at this and build new models to solving social and economic problems on the continent, then connectivity is a really important part of that discussion. That's why I said I feel like I'm speaking to the converted. That's why you're in the room, right? So this is, just talking then about the factors that, can accelerate the connectivity that we're speaking about. And again, it's not only infrastructure, it's not only security, it's also a lot around government, policymakers, regulation, multilateral development agencies, and where we choose to make the investments. And how do we make sure these investments really are impact programs that are really getting to these rural communities, all right? So I'm closing, but we're going into the panel, so I'm closing, but we're starting, all right? And my final remarks really are back to, just teasing out some of the key questions that we'll try and answer as we go into the panel. What we need to do from a policy intervention perspective on this usage gap that I've shown, the 680 million number. Financing models from an infrastructure perspective is also very interesting, all right? The financing models today, would it make economic sense, for rural communities? Again, we need to look at that. And if those financing models will not work, then what will work? So what do we need to do about those financing models? Reducing financial barriers to entries for users, also, I think, really important. How can we capture and monitor economic value, all right? And we're going to look at, we're going to touch on discussions around, pioneer, incentives, excise duties, what do we need to do from a tax perspective, from a policy perspective, and, government position. So, what is important is that a connected Africa is an imperative if we're really going to see accelerated growth on the continent. And I think that's going to be the subject of our discussion today. On that note, I'm just going to pause, hand over back to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Boye. All right, whilst Boye takes his seat, I'd like to introduce you all to our panelists today. To my right, we've got Mr. Tony Bao, the Vice President of Huawei. We've got Hardy Pemiwa from Cassava Technologies. He's the President and Group CEO. We've got Mr. William Sonnenberg. He prefers to be called Bill, so don't be surprised if we say Bill. It's him. Mr. Sonnenberg is the Global Director, Disruptive Technologies and Funds at the International Finance Corporation. And then we've got Jean-Philippe Guillet. He says he wants to be called JP. So also, if we call him JP, don't be surprised. He's the Senior Vice President, Global Sales, Media and Networks at Intelsat. Now, we're going to do this in several ways. We're going to move around the panelists, but towards the end, we'd also like you to join the conversation and ask them. These are some of the global leaders in their field, so it's a great opportunity also for you to engage with them. I'm going to start with a general sense, stronger public policies, streamlining access to rights of way, reform national plans and universal access funds. I'm going to start with you, Tony, from a high level, working our way through to, Hardy, and then Bill, and then JP, and then we'll take it away with the nitty-gritty on the questions. Go ahead, Tony.
Okay, all right. So I think from our experience, for example, in China, let's take China as an example. Also, back in 15 years ago, the rural coverage is a huge issue. Even the poverty in those regions is an issue. But looking about today, I think the poverty has been solved. And also the connectivity in rural area also being resolved. So from our experience, not only in China, but also in other regions, so there are several aspects I think we should take into consideration. First, as a state, as a government, we think that have a very systematic long-term planning is very important. Like the insight of this, the colleagues mentioned, if you don't have the persistent and long-term planning, and today, if you have some fund, you do something, and tomorrow you may change the idea. So this will make the whole, especially for rural areas, well, it will be very difficult. So this is point number one. I think from the government, top down, to have a long-term and strategic planning, this will be very essential. Point number two, I think the detailed policy. When you have the planning, like 5 years planning, then when you go to details, policies, several aspects could be also taken into consideration. For example, in most of the countries, even in European Union, they give the financial subsidiary or some support on the rural areas. So from financial perspective, it's some kind of incentives, either to the service providers or to the consumers. Second point is to build the infrastructure, be friendly towards the service provider. For example, give the open access, and also to relieve the bureaucracy for the permissions. So give this kind of the friendly policy to the service providers. Point number three, I think it's also very crucial to develop the applications, like colleagues just mentioned. For those people who live in the rural areas, how you can attract them to use the internet applications, either for content, for consumers, or for industries like healthcare, education, even farming, the more and more, for example, in China, a lot of videos, programs, education programs has been introduced just for the people who live in rural areas. So this will attract the people to use. And another thing I think is also very crucial is about the affordable, let's say, price, either for tariff or either for the device. I think put all this together, this somehow will accelerate and make the whole ecosystems be able to invest and to develop and to accelerate the coverage in rural areas.
Hardy, public policies.
So I am a glass half full guy. I think we need to recognize the work that policymakers have done. The industry is 25 years old in Africa. 25 years ago, we were talking about waiting lists in the urban areas running into thousands of people. 75% of Africans had not had any phone ring. So I think the arc tends towards progress. The fact that we're sitting here talking about internet usage in the rural areas, for me, just talks about the kind of progress that we have made. That we're no longer talking about basic telecom access in these areas. We are now talking about the next level of access. But having said that, you know, I don't think the challenge is as much policy as far as the rural connectivity is concerned. My colleague spoke about, you know, rights of way. Our own experience, having built over 100,000 kilometers of fiber across Africa, is that in the rural areas, you don't have a rights of way problem. You know, the rights of way problem exists in the urban areas. So the issue is really just, it's a hard problem. And as President Obama said, hard things are hard. We're going to spend time to find solutions that work. If you go to Australia, if you go to the US, rural connectivity is still a challenge in those countries. So I wouldn't be quick to point a finger at regulators and policymakers. They're dealing with a hard problem. And I think as private sector, just talking about, you know, the work that we do ourselves, and I'll come back to talk a bit more about this, it's really around taking advantage of emerging technologies, reducing costs, understanding that, you know, whilst the bulk of our people live in rural areas, just the way that they live is that they are not in close proximity to each other. And that obviously presents a challenge around how you actually, you know, connect them. You know, if you were to think back to 15 years ago, you know, 15 years ago in Kenya, you had this thing that was called Simu ya Jamii, which meant literally the phone for the family. And this was in the urban areas, where mobile phones, you know, you had kiosks that were in the urban centers where people would come and make a phone call using a mobile phone, you know, as a payphone. I think that, unfortunately, we may have thrown out the baby with the bathwater in some of these things. For rural connectivity, we may need to start thinking about those things as an initial way of making sure that we resolve the problem.
All right, Bill?
Thanks, and I do agree with my friend Hardy. Even in the US, I live in DC, but I have a home in the mountains of Montana, and I have to use Starlink, courtesy of Elon Musk, to get any Wi-Fi. When I think of kind of the regulatory opportunities, I think the real need is competition. I need JP to be competing with Hardy, to be competing with MNT, with Orange, because when we see competition, we see improved service, better operations, and more inclusivity in terms of how things work. I'll give you an example. Take Senegal. Senegal, and this is an adjacent business, had a monopolistic provider, Orange, for mobile money. Wave, a disruptor, invented a basic infrastructure technology to compete with them at a much lower price. They went from 0% market share to majority market share. Orange Money didn't lose customers. What Wave did only charging 1% one way is they brought a whole bunch of people that weren't storing money on a phone, most of which didn't own a phone, to all of a sudden join the digital revolution and become connected. So we have to think of this not just from a government policy perspective, not just from an infrastructure perspective, but also the ways that innovation can drive use cases and bring people connected into the market. And what bothers me in some places in Africa is the resistance to creating competition from state-owned entities, government-owned entities, the resistance of governments to lease out the 500,000 kilometers of dark fiber that sit on this continent that isn't being used, all of which can be contributed towards this effort and the opportunity. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill. JP.
Thank you very much. So a lot of very, very good points. I think the regulator today still has a role, and we need the regulator to enforce really policies in order to create the favorable environment. But I think we need to be realistic that they won't do it all on their own. And when I look at, because I have the chance to have a broad view, what regulators are doing in other parts of the world is when they issue spectrum, so you have spectrum licenses that are auctioned, and when they issue spectrum, then they also impose some coverage. And I think this is a very, very powerful tool to create an incentive. I hear you on the competition. I think there is something which we all need to really factor in. Deploying in rural area is about 3 times the cost of an urban site. This is GSMA number, with 10 times less revenue. So you have an economic challenge. And I think the problem is we expect a mobile network operator to deploy in an area where they are going to have less revenue, which is then going to benefit the overall economy. But for them, they're still running a private business. They run a business where they need to make money. So there is not one solution. The regulator needs to have a role. I think the regulator needs to really impose or drive certain coverage when they auction additional frequency band. And that's part of what they should be doing, but that's not the only solution.
All right, well, Bill wants to
Jump in
come
on
there.
JP's point, because we did a study of 400 spectrum auctions over the last decade, 3G, 4G, 5G. For every 1% lower price point of the auction price, you picked up 48 basis points of additional coverage in rural areas. So about half of the cost reduction. And then you have models out there which I think are really innovative, like Panama. So Panama instituted in both 4G and 5G, they said 50% of what we get in the auction, we're going to use to support the mobile network operators to have basically the same return on capital metric as they get in urban areas and rural areas to offset the point JP just made, which I think is an innovative way.
So can I be even a bit more, I'll go a step further and be a bit more controversial. I think today, one of the challenges we have is 70% of the traffic, which is on the mobile phone network operators, are the OTT traffic. So these are the Facebook, the YouTube that all of us are using. Reality is that none of them are contributing to establishing networks. So they benefit greatly, but they don't contribute in a way. And it should be, and there are a lot of discussions between the European mobile operators to find a way, a different business model. And that business model is a challenge in Europe, but that business model is a challenge anywhere in the world. And if we want really to do rural connectivity, we should find various ways of contributing to rural connectivity.
I hope there's no one from Google in the room.
I doubt it. You know, your point about spectrum auctions, right? Intelstar spans the breadth of connectivity from multiple touch points. The other side of it is that sometimes these spectrum auctions tend to benefit the established players in the market to the disadvantage of smaller players. I mean, where I come from in South Africa, we had our first spectrum auction in 17 years for the first time. And two of the big players, we call them a duopoly in our country, are the ones who had the capital resources, they had the financial firepower to come in and actually grab some of that spectrum. How do you then go around that from, a satellite point of view, because that's seen as the other frontier of connectivity to bypass some of the structural challenges of the established infrastructure and the network rollout that's needed for the outlay of a connectivity?
So the way we look at it is very simple. What we are doing is trying to make it a lot easier. It's all about being simple. It's all about being affordable. So how do we do that? We do that in creating local infrastructure. So you need to be local, and you need to provide a service which is more than a service, it's a solution. You need to be able to address what the customers are looking for. They're not looking, unfortunately, probably, they're not looking for satellite solution. They're looking for connectivity solution. And the only way you provide connectivity solution is by having local infrastructure and local teams that are able to address the requirements the way it is done in each country. So we have a service with Liquid in South Africa. We have services in the DRC where we have a local partner. And this is all about providing a service which is the right fit for the right market. So trying to be more local and trying to resolve an issue to remove some barriers to deploy in rural areas.
All right. I mean, Bill, you're involved in the disruptive technologies space, and some of the work you do, involves capital deployment as well as high-impact initiatives in emerging markets. However, some of the work you do, the other side of the coin of it is that it is an existential threat to legacy players. How do you balance that, against the imperative to connect versus the imperative to innovate?
It's an excellent question, but I don't think you need to balance. I think innovation is so key to solving this issue amongst health issues, education issues, and other development challenges in the continent of Africa. But I used WAVE as an example, but the other thing that we've been spending time working on is how do you use rural village schools as hotspots, where you can combine satellite technology to light up the school. You could use fiber, or you could use some other scenario, combine it with Microsoft's AirPlay or Google X's wide area low frequency bandwidth to increase coverage, and do that at a lower cost to bring the capital costs down. But again, I think disruption is important because you have to change the behavior of the duopoly, in your case in South Africa. You have to stir that pot up to drive down costs. We still have some of the highest data costs on the planet in Africa. When you have a huge population of 1.2 billion, 600 million of which are connected and using the internet, that needs to change. And the only way that changes is through competition and innovation.
All right, Hardy, I'm coming to you. So, I mean, Cassava is involved in some major and deep infrastructure work in the region where, some of these disparities in connectivity are quite pronounced. In what ways, are you working around this to ensure that there is deeper penetration and that more people on the continent are able to be connected and have access?
Okay, before I come to that, let me just, there's a question that you had asked, which I think it's important to make sure it's answered, which is the ICASA auction in South Africa.
Yes.
You said it, I didn't, so I think the issue is not whether or not the duopoly of MTN and Vodacom took the lion's share of the spectrum. The real question is, what did we do with the auction process? Because I think the elephant in the room coming back to policy, is we all are subscribers to the universal service funds. And really the challenge there is oversight. The universal service funds are by and large controlled by regulators or government departments. The contributors, who are the telecom players, have really very little say over how exactly they get used in order for us to solve some of these challenges like rural connectivity. So that's, I thought I would just
Thanks for that.
deal with that. But coming to the work that we are doing ourselves, we have developed fiber across the continent for the last, since 2004. From Cape Town to Cairo, we just launched our fiber connectivity now, connecting Mombasa to the west coast of the DR Congo, a place called Manda, so almost 9,000 kilometers. So really, east, west, north, south, there is a lot of fiber that's connecting Africa. We're connecting 300 towns and cities in between. I think what we have learned over these years is that the unit economics of data is what we need to resolve. So we can, you can move a gigabyte of data from a point of presence in Marseille in France to Mombasa for $1, $1 US penny. You probably can use this, you can move it from Mombasa to Nairobi for 2 to 3 pennies, US cents. To move the same gigabyte of data from our data center in Nairobi to a place called Pipeline, which is just 3-4 kilometers away, all of a sudden that jumps to $1.30 or $1.20. So solving the last mile connectivity problem, whether you're talking about the rural areas or you're talking about the urban areas, is really one of the things that we have learned we have to deal with. And our own view as Cassava Technologies through our subsidiary, Liquid Networks, and is that the Africa Missing Network, the network that we need to build, is the Wi-Fi network. If we can start to introduce Wi-Fi networks, because for the most part, the fiber broadband, backhaul, the long distance cables, they've been built. There is, our colleague here spoke about the huge coverage steps that we have taken, almost 92%. We've got coverage. But until we deal with this last mile, and it's an economics issue, it's about finding the technology that works in order for us to, and that's why working with some of our partners, we are deploying things like free space optics to deal with the middle mile. And we're working on Wi-Fi technologies in order to make sure that we can offer this last mile solution. Bill mentioned the use of schools and clinics, because the rural economy works around these places where people can gather. So what is it that we can do in order to improve connectivity on schools? We have had a project where we have mapped almost every school in Africa today. In Kenya alone, we mapped 40,000 schools, and we can now tell you where is this school, what kind of connectivity is it, how far is it from a fiber cable, how far is it from a base station, and what is the lowest cost to try and bring connectivity to this school. I think these are some of these things that we could do in order to solve the rural connectivity problem.
Tony, Huawei touches 3 billion people around the world, but these are mostly people in urban areas. You don't have that deep reach in the rural side of things. And you mentioned something interesting about Jianghao in China. Can you tell us more about that?
I think 3 billion people has been connected, while Huawei technology already including part of them from rural areas, because it's not possible that only for the urban areas or the bigger cities. So in general, I think when we're talking about the network planning for cities, for capitals, for urban areas, it's quite easy. Fiber and latest technology, always, because commercially you can make it very easy, return on investment. However, when we're talking about rural areas, you really need, as I mentioned in the beginning, from the government or from the regulator, you really need to think about how to make it happen. I think colleagues also mentioned about, actually for consumers, they don't care about what kind of technology, they just need access. So in this case, you have to think about what you can have. Fiber, you can have wireless, mobile broadband, or satellite. You have to think about the future evolution. What will be in the next 5 years, 10 years? How these areas will be developed. So from this perspective, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's really a challenge task for the government, for the regulations. Why I'm mentioning this, for example, in most of the countries, not only in China, in Europe, the same. When they launch the frequency auctions, especially now when we talk about the 5G, always they are combine the coverage responsibility with the cost of the spectrum. So either you will have pay higher cost for the spectrum and less obligation on coverage. Otherwise, which now in most of the countries, either from Brazil, from most of the European countries, they lower down the cost for spectrum, much lower even than 4G. But the coverage for the rural areas, for the nationwide, are much higher requirements than before. Because they believe, the government believes this is like a compensation for operators. I charge you less for spectrum, but you have to fulfill the application on coverage. So this is about mobile broadband. Meanwhile, for fixed, for fiber, as I mentioned also, quite often that in rural areas, the policymakers lifted the regulation on monopoly. For example, in the urban areas, in the capitals, always you must have 2, 3 to compete. But in rural areas, which is very difficult to have the economic beneficial. Therefore, this policy has been lifted. So in this case, that even you build the network and you will be serve all others. So in this case, to protect the initial investors, or even to give some incentives for those initial investors, to make them affordable, to make the business case flying. So this is about the fiber. Satellite is the same. Yeah? Satellite is the same. That's why I think this is the first point to mention. I'm saying about to build the network. Secondly, I think it's even more important to really to educate people to get used to it. Like, for example, like my parents also live in it's kind of rural area in China, southwest. In the past, my parents don't know how to use smartphones. But later on, when they understand all the, like an ID, all the very basic, daily based on some applications they have to use. And of course, with WeChat, with this kind of application, they can call me on video. Then gradually they start to use it, which it's not that difficult. As long as they have been educated, now they request for the better network. In the past, just 2 Mbps, now it's not enough, 10 Mbps. So I think this education, of course, together with the content, will be very important to encourage users to use it. And last thing I think is also very important, as I just mentioned, if the policymaker already give very affordable policy, either for spectrum or for fiber. So in this case, this will also allow operators, service providers, to lower down the cost. Even the tariffs they design for the people who live in the rural areas will be different than the people who live in the urban areas. So in this case, they can also another kind of incentives or encouragement. So that's something which I think this might help. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tony. I mean, the pandemic crystallized the importance of access as well as connectivity. There's the adage in tech startups, transform or die. The time is now for digital. Boye, you're agnostic to sectoral considerations, unlike our colleagues here. You basically have a high-level overview of what's happening on the continent. Where are we getting it right in terms of innovative models to connect the rural poor and bring them with us to this digital age that's upon us, or that is actually, in fact, with us?
Well, I think that there are a number of interesting sectors. One of the sectors that I think we've really made progress, and it's understated in sub-Saharan Africa, is particularly in fintech. If you look at the last few years, the fintechs and the fintech penetration in rural communities is really gaining ground. And, you know, there's stories that we know, like the M-Pesa story and all that. But there are a number of telecom companies, fintech companies, or partnerships that are doing things that are very innovative. Take, for instance, Equity Bank is a bank that has grown its market share in Kenya, largely on the back of serving an underserved or unserved rural community, and emerged very successful at doing it. And we're seeing other players across the continent also doing this. So we're seeing that very much in the FS sector. We're also seeing very promising signs in terms of the techs focused on agri-techs. How can we get, to rural farmers? So we're seeing platforms, marketplace platforms. The agricultural value chain is a very wide value chain. And just being able to connect farmers, with all the stakeholders in the agricultural value chain is something that we're seeing on the continent. I think a really interesting one is around health techs. Also, health techs, we're seeing them working with governments now, looking at new models for delivering primary health care to rural communities. So these are examples of really interesting sectors that we're seeing. But I think the point for me, and I see some of my colleagues have mentioned this point about, awareness for rural or, education of rural dwellers. I think there's a very important point around, the centricity of rural dwellers. We talk about customer centricity, we're talking about urban dwellers and their personas and so on and so forth. But do we know the rural dwellers? Do we know what their needs are? Do we really know how they behave and how they think? So when we see the coverage gap and the usage gap, I think it's symptomatic to me that there is a knowing problem of knowing this rural dwellers and understanding, what it is that they need as opposed to, prescribing to them what they need. And the organizations that can go that extra mile, engage them, get that intelligence, and really begin to work on use cases that are very focused on them, I think will make a real difference.
All right, just getting back, to the point that this is not charity. The IMF says that one of the misnomers of the current age is that policymakers on our continent have moved from looking at innovative growth models to looking at development as a poverty alleviation strategy, which is not the point of deploying all of these technologies. The point is that you want to leapfrog your current challenges in order to not only develop your current populations, but also grow economically. The interlink between connectivity, coverage cannot be understated. Are there policy tools in terms of tax incentive, pioneer tax status, as well as excise duties? Because, it is a money game. There is a bottom line. Companies speak about triple bottom lines, and when there is no investment case to be made, the trade-off there could be that some areas will miss out on the opportunity. You'll start off, JP, and then we'll go down to Bill, Hardy, as well as Tony. You can also come in, Boye.
Okay, thank you. So I think rural is about three things. It's about coverage, it's about affordability, and it's about, you call it literacy, content, or gap of consumption. Today, from a coverage standpoint, there is no technical difficulty anymore. I mean, we have made so much progress. I think sometimes there is a perception. The reality is there are solutions today. Affordability is really important, and I'll go further than the affordability of the connectivity. This is the affordability of the terminal. It's the smartphone. And I think today, major challenge that we have in rural area is that most of the phones that are still used in rural area in Africa are feature phone. So if you want to go one step further and provide applications, you really need to have affordable smartphone. And there are many initiatives. Some of the mobile network operators have adopted different standards. Some of the mobile network operators have agreed to commit to a large volume in order to reduce the price. But I don't think we have cracked it yet. And if you really want to think about the impact of rural connectivity, you need to think about affordability of a smartphone.
Right, Bill?
I was going to say the same thing, that cracking, which I think there is, services required for the rural audience is a key piece, but the actual affordability of the device is another one. So if I think of one area of tax that really matters, it's the tax on importing devices. It's 60% of the cost, number one. And so you could actually waive that tax for rural customers, which brings down the cost. The second is we need innovation in operating systems on smartphones. We pretty much have a duopoly again with iOS and Android, but then there are newcomers coming up like KaiOS that's basically taken advantage of Android being open source to dumb it down so it still has really key features that allow people to do financial transactions and other things, but you're not going to necessarily be able to take 2-hour videos on your phone. And so that by itself would reduce the Google $40 smartphone down to $20. If you waive the import tax on that device, it becomes $10. If we actually broaden some of the fintech platforms that are operating in Southeast Asia and Latin America, they're using microfinance with a software overlay to lock a phone if people stop paying for the device. You make affordability universal on the device. And I think that is an area we also have to focus on.
All right. Hardy?
I just want to touch on the issue of knowing the rural dweller, because I think that you're onto something there. If you think about how much progress we have made on mobile money, now we have many people who are Africans in the room here. I would like hands up anybody who has attended or whose parents or grandparents attended any seminar on mobile money. There was no seminar, okay? There was community education because people understood the usage of it. So I think we should not confuse literacy with education. Literacy is there to be able to use the technologies that are available today. So in terms of deploying, dollars, let's not spend more money trying to say that we want to bring literacy. I think we can deal with education, which is making sure that people are using technologies for the next thing, to start companies, to sell things, to develop, micro websites and these kind of things. I think the real issue here is really solving the affordability. I think affordability is the elephant in the room. And, I'm glad that maybe there are no, my colleagues from the mobile phone industry are not in the room. I hope they're not. But you're not going to reduce affordability with a GSM tower. Okay, the boundary conditions that you need in order for you to reduce the costs by increasing the 4G or 3G coverage is just going to cost you. A base station costs $60,000. It costs $60,000. It's $60,000. And as my colleague here said, you're doing that and you're getting 10 times less money by deploying it. So I come back to the Universal Service Fund. I come back to last mile technologies. I think for us, just looking at what we have been able to do by bringing fiber into these places where you had previously excluded people, is that there is sufficient capacity for the most part in terms of, to the school, to the clinic, on the main road, to the base station. But what do we do in order to make sure that we solve for the Africa Missing Network? And our view as Cassava Technologies, which I hope that my friend here from the IFC will help us, is let's solve the Africa Missing Network, because anywhere else, when you have solved the missing network, then you solve the usage problem.
All right, Tony, then Boye, please.
Okay, so I think either, which I just mentioned about the lower down the cost for frequency, or in some countries impose different kind of tax, or even they give some like a coupon or vouchers for the users which they are in the rural areas. So all these tools I consider like financial tools to lower down the cost, make it more affordable, from either building the infrastructure or for end users to be able to consume the let's say the benefit of the experience, the network. On the other hand, which colleagues also mentioned about the device, which in fact it's a issue, I think, not only for smartphones but also even for the other CPEs, which is for internet, for Wi-Fi, this kind of stuff. Especially if I'm not wrong, I think in the past 2 years, due to many reasons, the price for the heavy goods, the price for raw materials increased, and in certain areas, lack of competition. So instead of, because I worked in Europe for 15 years, I remember back in 2019, in MWC in Barcelona, we forecast the 5G CP, the price will drop from $500 to $200 in 2 years. But as today, still not. Why? Because in the past 2 years, as I mentioned, price for the heavy goods, price for the raw materials, and also lack of competition in certain areas, make the whole industry don't go this direction, not like in 4G era. So I think because Huawei is manufacturer for infrastructure, ICT infrastructure, but also device. So we are always keeping a very open approach, saying that all the industry players really need to work together. Monopoly, this will kill the industry. Monopoly will not drop the price down. I think that will be the conclusion. However, I think as it today, Huawei or I know many other manufacturers on smartphones, CP device, they're working on another way in order to really to decrease the price. Otherwise, as you can see today, all the ICT products, consumer products, the quantity are shrinking month by month. Means that the market demand is going down. If we keep this level of price, I think this volume will be continually going down, which in the end, this will not help to make the price of the whole industry going down.
All right, I mean, Boye, you're sitting at this issue sort of at an arm's length as an agnostic observer as well. Your views on this?
I think there's a cost to serve issue, but I also think there's a business model issue. My sense is, the view has to be longer term, all right, longer term thinking. In the short term, I honestly think that serving this segment is not the most profitable segment. If it's going to be profitable at all, it's questionable. But if you look at the longer term and what we've seen, and I'm from Nigeria, where we had just a few million people just over a decade ago that had phones, and then we had this whole auction and GSM, and here we are with MTN, 80 million people. The ARPU is not great. The revenue per user is not great, but 80 million is 80 million. If 80 million people give you $10 every month, that's $800 million. So to me, it's about scale. And if you look at the figure we're talking about here, 680 million people that are not using the internet, clearly we have to find a business model that solves that problem. It's something about scale, I think it's something about timing, and it's about the cost to serve.
All right, JP, I'd like you to come in on there. Is there really a trade-off, between greater accessibility and the profit imperative of some of the operators?
I think it really depends on how you look at it. If you look at it short term, I think it's clear. Any of our customers would tell you. And when I speak with our CFO, every time I come with a project, he would say, okay, what is the return I'm making on investing on your project versus other projects? The MNOs are doing the exact same thing. What do? Do I install another 4G station in Lagos, or do I install a 2G, a 3G, or a 4G in a village of 5,000 people? Where is the highest return? That's the reality of what we live with. So we have to find ways, and we are working hard in order to provide affordable connectivity. And in order to do that, you need to be local, and you need to have the tools and being able to make it as efficient as you can. But you have a short-term challenge. And I think we can all be convinced, like me, about the long-term profitability. Reality of rural deployment is you can't expect the same type of return. But it's still, we have invested in a company which is called AMN, which is just doing rural connectivity. This is the only thing they do. This can be a profitable business. It's scalable, it's replicable, and it's profitable. But it's not easy. The dollar that you invest in that business doesn't give you the same return as a dollar that you invest on urban areas.
Thanks for that. Bill, I'd like you to come in here from the point of view of your platform. There's some exciting initiatives that you're driving as the IFC in the private sector. And, some of the work really bypasses these limitations. Can you, take us into your confidence about some of these initiatives?
There's nothing that's comes specifically of mind that I have to worry about confidence, but thank you. But look, the IFC operates in the private sector with a focus on development and making money at the same time. So we want commercial returns and solving big development challenges. This is a perfect example of one that needs more brains than just the people within the World Bank Group to solve. They need a true public-private partnership across the board with regulatory policy, financing, thinking about the next spectrum auction, what the rules of that auction are. Is those rules going to be, there needs to be an increase of 50% more rural connectivity, therefore bid less, so that you're spreading your return on invested capital across urban and rural in a way where you have to abide by the rules of the auction, but you're going to make that investment and you're going to factor that into the price you're willing to pay. Or use universal access funds dedicated for rural subsidies to support the CapEx costs of the MNOs or the fiber players to get closer to that last mile solution, whether that's through the schools or clinics with other technology on top of those to increase a kilometer or so of coverage with new technologies available. But this is not something the people on the stage are going to solve. This requires governments and the private sector to work hand in hand to attack. And so our view is this is a perfect path of a new form of PPP to solve this challenge. Across all elements we talked about, digital skills, access, affordability, and competition. Thanks.
Hardy, there's a positive correlation between access, connectivity, and economic growth. You understand this quite intimately, in terms of some of the work and the projects that Cassava Technologies and its subsidiaries are involved in on the continent. Can you also talk to this point, about the trade-offs and some of the decision-making that goes into this work?
Yeah, our vision is a digitally connected future that leaves no African behind. And if you have 600 million people that are still left behind, it means our work is not done. And so that's what drives us. That's why we, we've spent the last 12 months, for example, building a network from one part of the DR Congo through, fairly inhospitable territory, just to make sure that we can open up the hinterland of the country and bring connectivity to some of the towns and cities that, frankly, if you looked on the map, they are not on the map, but when you arrive in this town, there's 1 million people, there are 4 million people. So we started to build our network from the ground up in 2004 as an open access network. This was critical from day one to ensure that you don't have duplication of infrastructure. So one of the ways in which we're dealing with the unit economics is making sure that every kilometer of fiber that we put in the ground is open access. So it obviates the need for other players to use that same fiber. Fiber has almost limitless capacity, and that's why we use it as our primary, technology of choice for connectivity. The trade-off, in terms of, profitability and economic development, I don't think that is either or. We have to put connectivity in because it drives economic development, because it improves employability of people, because it improves competitiveness of our economies. Again, just going back to this, project that we are so proud of, Congo is one of the biggest countries on the continent. 7, 8 years ago, with 11 neighbors, they were not connected to any of them with fiber broadband. We have now connected them. It's connected to Angola, it's connected to Zambia in the south, and therefore can essentially be connected to all the undersea fiber cables that are on the western seaboard and on the eastern seaboard. And you can see what has happened to the costs of access as we have done that. To give you a sense, the cost of access has come down in Lubumbashi, for example, by almost 40% over the last 18, 24 months. That's 40% back in people's pockets. And that 40% can now be used for other things by those users that drives economic development in their localities. Thank you.
Tony, where are you making headway?
So I think for us, as technology solution provider, we put all our efforts to better understand the challenges for each scenarios and make it as affordable, but as leading, as future-oriented as much as, for example, give you an example, solutions deployed in Lagos or deployed in Cairo should be much different than in the rural areas because the density of the population is so high and the resource actually is quite limited. Same in big cities in Europe, big cities in China. So you have to make the sites to be as powerful as possible, very powerful. But meanwhile, also you have scenarios like in the rural areas, very spread population, and they don't have such high demands on the capacity, but they need coverage. And there is lack of the fiber or lack of the electricity. So you have to make the sites as compact as possible, as big coverage as possible, but not such capacity. So we have to fulfill, and meanwhile, like in Egypt, in desert, also the conditions, it's very, very, very challenging. So you have to make your solutions to be able to deploy even in those areas, like in Saudi Arabia, but meanwhile also in the Nordic countries. So you have to design the solutions to fulfill almost all the challenging scenarios, make it as affordable as possible, but meanwhile also looking future-oriented. So this is, I think, it's our responsibility, and which are working on that. Meanwhile, same for device, as I mentioned, because we strongly believe that only when we make the whole ecosystems can benefit from this program, or can benefit from the project, benefit from the network, this can work smoothly in long term, in long run.
Boy, do you want to have a word there before we go to the audience for some questions?
No additions from me.
No additions from you. All right. Okay, there's a hand there. Is there a mic for the gentleman there who would like to ask a question? I will go to him myself. Please introduce yourself and direct your question.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Kevin Waibi. I am the Managing Director for the Edo State Investment Promotion Office based in Nigeria. Very interesting when you talk about local connectivity, because presently what we are doing in our state is exactly connecting the locals. If you know what they call local government areas, we have about 18, and we just recently got into some collaboration with one of the vendors to connect fiber to all 18 local governments because of the locals. Now, the challenge we have observed is that, yes, you may not have the sort of revenues you are looking at the local areas, but if you collaborate with the government, it's easier to get it done. And one of the ways you can easily reduce costs in terms of that is what they call the right of way. Because the right of way usually is the big cost for most of the businesses that want to come in to do connectivity. So the question for me is, how will the private sector work better with government? Like in Nigeria, for example, most of the governments are well opened because I see IFC here, the World Bank with the ease of doing business, working on right of way, making sure that there's a standard cost for it. So how do we strengthen that collaboration? Because without government, the infrastructure really becomes a huge problem. And looking at medical right now, just a few months ago, we had medical doctors come from the Americas, and they were doing telemedicine, being able to just take care of the young, the rural people, the primary health care centers from the US through telemedicine. So invariably, looking at the social aspect, we need to be able to connect our rural areas. So how do we strengthen that and get away from talk to action? So thank you.
All right, how do we get away from talk to action? Right of way? Please go ahead, Hadi.
So we have some practical examples of what we have done. In South Africa, in the Eastern Cape province.
Where I'm from.
That's why I picked Eastern Cape. So we're working with the Eastern Cape provincial government to bring infrastructure on a model where we have rolled out fiber and last mile solutions connecting almost 2,700 schools, clinics, and government buildings in a partnership that allows us to, to still deploy open access fiber and open access last mile solutions, which provides that basic connectivity, but allows us to then use that same network to serve businesses, small and large, in the province. We've replicated that in the Western Cape government, and we expect to be able to take that model to other countries. So really what the gentleman is saying, it works, as long as there is provincial government leadership or local government leadership. What we have found in other countries, where we have tried this, it's really to have a willing local authority that has got the kind of vision that understands that private money requires a return, even as we are doing good.
Thank you, Hadi. Anybody else with questions for the panel? We've got Tony Bao, we have got Hadi Pemiwa from Cassava Technologies, we've got Bill from the IFC, we've got Jean-Philippe from Interstel. Any other questions? Please don't be shy. I don't bite. Great.
Hello, panel. My name is Tunde Koka, Ayo Tunde Koka, MD of Open Access Data Centers. Now, if, with the Africa Free Trade, Continental Free Trade area going on, pervasive digital infrastructure, connectivity, data centers, access points, and so on are key, as in a way it's been implied by what you've said. So if you had a request to the AFCFTA DG or community or whatever to really achieve the adoption, what would it be?
AFCFTA, your wish list? Anyone want to take it? Bill, do you have a perspective on it?
I mean, I have one perspective, and only just to stay on topic here of digitization and digital infrastructure, which is, there's a lot, we're just coming out of our annual meetings, or spring meetings with the IMF World Bank Group, and met with lots of finance ministers, including the finance minister of Nigeria, where we pushed him to work on open access of their dark fiber. But there's a growing trend where countries, despite the free trade agreement, want their own data center as opposed to shared infrastructure. And I think one of the opportunities is actually shared infrastructure. I take as an example, there's a large data center in Bahrain that serves the entire Middle East. Each country in the Middle East doesn't have their own data center. They use a very large one that's structured as an embassy, effectively, for each of their countries. Benefits from economies of scale, drives down costs, maintains data sovereignty and privacy, but is so much more economic. So let's be thinking about those types of opportunities as we really digitize, build data center capability across the continent.
Hadi, I saw you wanted to come in here. AFCFTA.
I think, the Continental Free Trade Area, it's a good policy platform. Digital connectivity is an imperative. If I look at the challenges that we have faced in building cross-border fiber, and sometimes just the time it took us to cross from one country to the next because of the differences in regulation, the lack of recognition of licenses across borders, at borders, I think to drive the digital economy and make sure that the Continental Free Trade Area really realizes the benefits that we're talking about. Yes, free movement of people is important, free movement of goods and services is important, but we need to recognize that none of those in today's world can really happen without digital enablement. And so having a work stream, which I know that the folks at the Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat are working on, I just think that it needs to be put at the forefront of the conversation, that we don't need to follow the path that other free trade area organizations have done. I think we're coming at this at a time when technology is a lot more advanced, where we've been able to demonstrate as Africans that we can leapfrog, if you look at what we've done in the fintech revolution. So we don't need to walk the same path that the EU walked as far as the free trade area is concerned. We need to really put technology at the forefront and have not just a seat, but a prime seat at the table in making sure that we make a success of this.
Thank you, Hadi.
Can I just...
you want to come in?
A quick comment. I think, Tunde and I were having this conversation just before we started this. But, Hadi summed it up well. I just think African governments and institutions need to be intentional about the question of data sovereignty and ensuring that we have data centers, particularly for the public cloud, that are positioned as critical infrastructure on the continent. All right, the challenge we have now is that the public cloud data centers are located in a certain region, and some countries will feel excluded and won't want to be part of that, and so on and so forth. So that conversation needs to be, at the Africa leadership level. It needs to be intentional, and like Hadi said, we can leapfrog. So we're not reinventing and taking suboptimal decisions. Data centers are shared infrastructure, but they're national critical infrastructure if you take a cloud perspective. So I very much support that, point of view, and I think for me it's just about intentionality.
All right. Thank you, Boy. By the way, MTN is in the room, Hardy. Before we conclude, does anybody else want to have a bite at the cherry? MTN has a question.
Good afternoon. I'm Makhatu Medlo from MTN. I can't respond to all of the questions. I have other colleagues who comments that are more capable of that. My part of the business is the enterprise business, the B2B part. And my question is, this is an issue that we grapple with when we work with some of our clients in the banking space, and that's supporting and enabling small to medium enterprises, because we both share the same objective. And I'm just interested also from the IFC and the gentleman from KPMG on the thoughts on that, because enabling business, we talk about rural, but there's a lot of business that in its very nature is based in rural areas. And it's an ongoing battle that we try to do to balance and come up with the right price points to make those businesses part of the greater ecosystem.
Thank you very much, MTN. Before you answer that, after you've concluded with that, could you just all conclude with one word each when the question has been answered from the gentleman from MTN, the takeaway from this discussion? You can go ahead and answer.
I'll just start. So IFC is going to answer first. So I think you're spot on that SMEs are the heart and soul of Africa. And when you're thinking, we can't think about urban versus rural divide. You actually have to think about enterprise and large and small, and how we're really thinking about increasing financial inclusion. We're thinking about how we're providing services that improve the productivity of those SMEs, regardless of whether they're in a village or they're in the outskirts of Lagos. And it is a very important part of what IFC is focused on doing, leveraging the benefits of technology to start to include those SMEs more directly in the global, not just local, global economy. And I think there's a huge opportunity. I take Nigeria as an example. Some of the greatest fashion designers are in Nigeria. They're small businesses. They have no connectivity to Hollywood in the US to sell their designs. We have to fix that. That's called e-commerce. It's solvable. But there's a logistics challenge. If that small fashion designer is actually in a rural area of Nigeria, how does she get her dress that she made to a place where it can be actually shipped in a reasonable time period to go to Europe or the US, to drive hard currency into the country from a SME? Those are all challenges that we're trying to figure out how we address, thinking about technology above and beyond the connectivity that we need to rely upon you to make that order come from the US through either Hardy's cable and then for your last mile connectivity on the mobile phone to make that transaction happen.
Thank you, Bill. JP, Bill, Hardy, Tony, and Boyer, and our audience, thank you for this afternoon. We've run out of time on the session. That's it for us. Bye.